The purpose of this last panel, if you will, is to ask the question, from the insights perhaps you've gathered from the conference to date, and from questions that you have thought about, where might be the directions in the context of future research into compassion that might illuminate all of us or maybe steer us perhaps in different directions. What I'd like to do is to have each of the panelists introduce themselves and perhaps a little bit about their own background, and then each individual, once they've introduced themselves, the way it will work is we'll just go in this direction. Once the individual has introduced himself, given his background, then he will make his comments. The other individuals will comment, and then we'll go through, and then at the end, we'll address or have questions, if that's okay. So.
Oh, I was sitting here thinking we'll start there.
And he came to me and whispered in my ear that he wanted to start here. So.
Okay. Yeah, well, deviousness. My name is Mohamed El-Hodiri. I started my life in Egypt on the Rosetta branch of the Nile, where you learn to look for things, including a Rosetta Stone. And my background is coming from it started with the Islamic tradition, but it is really becoming more and more Abrahamic, which is not saying much because Abrahamic is the same in all the three religions. So I'd like to bring some of that perspective here, and you'll find it in accordance with all we have been hearing from, say, Buddhist traditions. I am an economist, and I am a heterodox economist. I don't accept that people are of equal power, which is the basic assumption made by orthodox economists, because political economy, as started by Adam Smith, is the integration of power and money. And if you just make it about money, you are leaving off the whole thing. One of the things of the 1% in the context of this society, what they can do is they can change the law, and by changing the law, they change the contract law, change the rule of the game when we're still playing. So I couldn't believe that their power is equal to mine. I spent my life going between academia and being a practicing economist. Practicing economist lives the economic recommendations that he makes, and I did the practicing in Egypt, Algeria, Sudan, and then, but mostly in Russia. Earlier on, I was a student in Russia, but later on, I came as an advisor to both the executive and legislative branch of government. And my mission was to go against the advice of orthodox economists, and I was proved right. Anyway, they said, assume an economy. Well, you have to build one. You cannot assume a market. You have to build a market institutionally. My academic life has been in mathematical economics, very, very abstract, and I publish in mathematics journal and in economics journals, Econometrica, others, and I write books where I put the stuff that I cannot publish because they are too heterodox to be accepted.
Well, maybe what you could do is then give us some of your unorthodox views, and we can either decide if we agree with the unorthodox view, and maybe we're more orthodox than we would like to be. So maybe let's hear about
That's what I'm sorry I took too long in the background because, all right. From what I hear here and from what I do, I advocate, is I feel like a kid in a candy store when I come to this conference because I hear words that I love to hear: compassion, idea of creating the structure Now, one of the things that I would like to talk about and that I work on is the construction and maintenance of social capital, and in particular, spiritual capital. Now, the idea of social capital is that in Orthodox terms, it would have a productivity. Social capital has a social productivity, marginal social productivity in economics language, and therefore it deserves a wage. So there is a social wage where the people, as we have heard recently, attitude to charity, if it is something I deserve, not something that someone gives to me because they want to give me. It's something that I have to have because I'm here, because I'm productive. This is the social wage, is the non-charity of me getting an education, getting health care, getting other things because I'm a member of society. It's a right. So this is the one main thing. And the other is that the structure, and I look at the economy as a dynamical system, but I know that the law of motion of that dynamical system is not fixed, that there is no structural rigidity in economic laws. There is structural malleability, in fact, to the point of being endogenous. That is that people who are playing the game change the rules. One last thing is a theorem which says, much ado about nothing, to quote Shakespeare. Theorem says this, that what economists, orthodox economists talk about, they talk about equilibrium. And their idea of equilibrium is voluntary equilibrium, meaning I want to be there. I choose to be there. Well, in fact, Adam Smith said that what you see in the world is a bargaining equilibrium. I bargain with you, and the equilibrium is dependent on our relative comparative power. If you're more powerful than me, then it comes your way. If you're less, it comes my way. Then, just the last thing is that they are equal. Voluntary equilibrium equals the bargaining equilibrium if and only if everybody has equal power. Probability of equal power is 0. Therefore, a lot of orthodox economics is about nothing.
Well, I think that says it all. Where's Bill at?
Yeah, well.
But, you know, the interesting thing about that, though, is that when you talk about that fact, if it is a fact indeed, is this observation, though, that individuals, though when they are given something which they don't feel they deserve, actually oftentimes give it back. Yeah. So while I agree with you that in the context of your statements, which fundamentally is a social justice statement, and I'm certainly supportive of that reality, or I shouldn't say supportive of it, cognizant of that reality, on a human level, though, we see repeatedly individuals who, against their own economic self-interest, demonstrate compassion. So I think there's certainly hope in that regard. Maybe we can just move on to Daryl, and you can tell us a little bit about yourself and sort of...
So my name's Daryl. First, I just want to thank you, Jim, and Emiliana. I don't know where you are in the audience, but for inviting me here to be here today. It's an honor. So I'm a social psychology doctoral candidate. So I do a lot of work on moral emotions. I got into compassion because it's just such an interest. It's obviously so pivotal for human morality, but it's also really fickle in so many interesting ways. So I don't really have time to talk about it, but what I focus on and what brought me here was this idea that Thupten mentioned at the end of his talk, the notion of a compassion collapse. So why is that the case that we feel more compassion for a single victim than compared to when there are many victims? So something like a hurricane, a natural disaster, etc. And thinking back to what I've seen over the course of the conference, there's a lot of interesting ideas, this notion of, well, what triggers whether we accept our compassion? What triggers whether we decide to enter into a compassionate state? And in my research, I examined how the collapse of compassion, this lack of compassion that we often feel for many suffering victims, reflects just such a defensive stance. We're concerned about being emotionally, psychologically overwhelmed by our compassion. We're concerned about the financial costs of our compassion. And for that reason, we take steps to try to turn off the compassion we would feel when many victims are suffering. And I find this case kind of morally compelling. I mean, it's that situation in which compassion is needed the most, when there are lots of suffering victims, that a lot of studies show that we feel it the least. So that's what I do, and that's a kind of a rather dire thing to study, I suppose. But
You're like Dr. Cole, who his shtick is death, right? Yours is more compassion collapse. Is that?
Yeah, it's not as dire as death, no. But one thing, the positive upshot of our research is that we suggest that people have the choice as to whether they can feel compassion when many people are suffering in a crisis. And so we try to show that if you can get people to get people motivated to turn towards their compassion, again, which you can see in so many of the compassion building interventions from yesterday or 2 days ago, and if we can get people to learn how to be with and tolerate their compassion, which again we saw in many of the compassion building interventions, we can combat this and we can actually get people to feel levels of compassion that are consistent with their moral principles.
Well, and just to comment, I think that's absolutely correct in the sense that, and this clearly is a future direction, and this is pivotal, I would just say, in the sense that we talk about the limitations of our in-group biases, if you will, which stops us from going beyond. And in fact, I think this is in part a manifestation of that as well. It's beyond us, it's beyond our group. And the challenge is to get over this evolutionary construct that limits that ability. And I think that would be a good area to really try to focus on. What do you think?
Yeah, so actually that's a great point. We're actually doing research now that looks at whether there are intergroup biases in this collapse of compassion effect. So, again, the collapse is this idea you feel more compassion for one than for many. Well, does that display itself more prominently for your in-group by comparison to your out-group? And if so, can we find ways to train people in emotion regulation that would help to combat against such biases?
Wonderful. And I think that actually pushes us up towards, this is not Matthias, I want you to know. Cliff is not trying to steal his identity. But unfortunately, Matthias cannot be with us. He had to leave for a family emergency, and I hopefully we can all just give a moment to support him in that regard. And he would stay, but I really wanted him to go, and it's really quite important that he leave. So Cliff was kind enough to step in. So Cliff.
So thank you, Jim, very much for giving me the opportunity.
A 5-second notice.
And the spontaneous notice, which is an oxymoron. To be a member of this august panel. So I think there are a number of themes that bear highlighting that have emerged from much of the material that's been presented here. I think one of the most important things to consider for the research going forward is the really imperative requirement to deeply understand individual differences. And at this point, there's been so many convergent evidence for differences in genetic background, differences in psychological history, differences in worldview, differences in, now we even know where you live. Maybe we should all move to Rochester, but then there'll be too much of a population density. So I think that one can actually begin to consider, particularly in the context of training studies, differences from both measures that we have from social psychology and physiology and overt behavior in economic games, but also really what is the meaning importance for individuals in a more qualitative sense. I think we don't spend enough time listening to people's experience of their encounter with suffering. I'm sure there are individuals who in fact experience high levels of personal distress in the perception of suffering, and then a second level of distress about their distress. And that I haven't heard brought out. Another thing I think that's really something that touched me was and Jimpa mentioned this, there's some deep similarity between wishing for the happiness and wishing for the relief of suffering, and they're not opposites. And so I think we need to understand this interrelatedness of individuals as a fundamental fact, that where we sort of, Judson talks about no self, but there's also that self isn't here. We've repeatedly talked about the reality of emergences of resonance. We've talked about empathic resonance, we've talked about behavioral resonance. And there's a fascinating paper in Trends in Cognitive Science by Hassan and Asif Gansfahar at Princeton that actually has a figure of Granger causality equations on the arm of someone as they gesture, because simply perceiving the dynamics of this gesture changes the brain activation state of those who are listening. And I think Steve Porges brought this up, as well as, this idea of expanding this green zone that Ferdows touched on. So when I think about moving forward, I think about situating beyond the laboratory. We do research on undergraduates and they get a bad name, but each one is already, 20 years into this mystery. And I think we need to get deeper. I think that would be what I think the future is, getting deeper. That's for my non-prepared.
It was wonderful. I don't think Dr. Phil Zimbardo needs introduction to most people. He's one of the most eminent psychologists in the world, and it's really wonderful to have him here. But he has a very interesting perspective that I think is important, and is actually not something which we have touched on. And I think at least the understanding of that perspective, I think, could be very important. And
Right.
maybe you can.
Okay, for the people who are not psychologists, I'm Phil Zimbardo. I'm an experimental social psychologist, professor emeritus at Stanford after 40 years, and I teach at the Palo Alto University. My main focus has been understanding the power of situations and systems to dominate individuals and dispositions. And I spent much of a lifetime trying to understand the nature of the dark side, creating evil in the laboratory in various experiments, some of which have become fairly infamous. But I recently had a conversion, and now I'm focusing only on the bright side.
Hallelujah, hallelujah.
Focusing on the bright side. So essentially, my focus, my goal, and a nonprofit organization I set up in San Francisco is what are the conditions that we can create that can inspire and empower people of all ages, especially youth, to stand up, speak out, take action in challenging situations, to do the right thing when some people are doing the wrong thing and when all the rest of us are doing no thing. And we call that the Heroic Imagination Project. What I enjoyed most about this conference was the incredible feast. I mean, we were really guests at enormous feasts. Feast of ideas, of theories, of conjectures, of remarkable set of data. And what was most unusual compared to usual psychology conferences was the integrative nature of the talks, really illustrated in the last one from the work being done at Max Planck Institute, seeing the range of disciplines that are essential to understanding these dynamics. And so they focused on exploring meditation, mindfulness, empathy, altruism, compassion. And in Leah Weiss's talk, she said the fourth level of compassion was a willingness to act. A willingness to act is a motivation. It's an action potential. So what was missing for me in the whole conference is ACT. No action. All of it is a potential for action, an assumption that if you're compassionate, then you will act. there are huge barriers between motivation, intention, reasoning, decision-making, judgment, and action. And we have to understand what those barriers are. Some of them are awkwardness, some of them not having the essential social skills, not having the social support, being in negative peer groups that suppress it. And so it's all the reasons why the failure of bystanders to intervene is something that we need to know more about. So I just want to talk very quickly about 3 lines of research, some of which has been funded by CCARE, trying to explore the nature of heroism. So Bob Levine mentioned that minorities have been found to show more kindness to strangers. Several other presentations presented the paradox of people who are economically disadvantaged being more altruistic. Well, we just completed a study of, it was a random probability survey study of 4,000 Americans, exploring the extent to which they are engaged in heroic actions. Action on behalf of others in need, exposing fraud or corruption, aware of the risks and risk to career or life and limb, and that's what differentiates heroism from altruism. And you do it without expectation of reward. 800 or 20% of these randomly chosen people qualified as heroes. And the most dramatic finding was that African American men and women were twice as likely as Caucasians to have engaged in a heroic act. And Hispanic men, but not women, were twice as likely than Caucasians to engage in a heroic act. Now, we're trying to explore what's the reason. I mean, people have said maybe more empathic, but and this is really a really dramatic finding that we want to follow up. We're doing research on whistleblowing, for which there's no experiment. There's almost no research on heroism, which is really surprising. If you ask me, how do you get a good person to do a bad thing, I can give you a recipe that in a half an hour, I could get most people.
Become a banker.
Most people do really bad. But we don't really know. How do you get ordinary people to engage in heroic action of any kind? So whistleblowing is one kind of heroic action really against a corrupt system. So experimentally what we do in a study just completed in Amsterdam, we recruit students to try to persuade the Human Subjects Committee to let us do a really unethical study. It's on sensory deprivation that produces hallucinations and so forth. And the students, we tell them, if we get the grant, we can hire you as a research assistant. So there's motivation. And what they have to do is go in a separate room, and there's a letter we prepared, and they have to add a sentence using the words enthusiastically support, it's really great, etc. If they do that, they are obeying an unjust authority. They could refuse to send it, they're just disobeying, and they could blow a whistle because they could add a personal statement against it. When we described the study to 200 students at the University of Amsterdam, 80% said, I'd be a whistleblower. When they're in the situation, it's 8%. 80% obey. And so now what we're trying to do is, how do you create whistleblowing? So in a study we're doing in Sicily, one of the things we're trying to do is say, think about your most important virtues, independence, freedom, achievement, and think about moral courage. Describe a time in your life when you acted with moral courage. And the idea is, doing that, self-reflecting on this aspect, will it really give you the moral muscle to challenge the system to be a whistleblower? So this is the kind of research we're doing. But the most exciting research we've just completed is, we call it CAPS, Creating a Partner. And we've just finished interviewing 30 men and women who were part of violent gangs, who for some reason dropped out and now working against the gangs. It's heroic because the gangs want to kill them, because they're cutting off their supply of recruits and also cutting off money supply. And at the same, so what we're doing, for each one, we've given them two-hour interviews by clinical graduate students at Palo Alto University, well-trained. And we have a parallel study now in Israel where we finished interviewing Israelis and Palestinians who suffered in the war, suffered in all the skirmishes, conflict. But instead of wanting revenge, as the rest of Israel and Palestine wants, these people are seeking reconciliation. It's heroic because they are now rejected by friends and family. So the basic question is, how do you account for this transformation of human nature? From being either doing bad things to doing really good things. In many cases, these people are creating youth groups to work against the basic principles that the gangs are espousing of peace, of compassion, of reconciliation. And in Israel, they are really promoting caring, compassion, reconciliation. And the exciting thing about it is we're writing articles about it. There will be a book. But there's a movie that was just made. It's first time in history there's a documentary movie made about the research, started by an Israeli filmmaker named Yoav Shamir, who came to my home 3 years ago when I was working with Ronnie Berger, who's the Israeli psychologist, clinical psychologist. He's actually a trauma psychologist, goes around the world whenever there's some disaster. And he did all the work in Israel, and Yotam Heineberg and I did the work in the United States. And he's made a film of the whole progress. When we're talking about the ideas, how we train the graduate students, then many of the interviews that I did and other people did with the Israelis, the Palestinians, and the gang members. There is a trailer on the CCARE website. Now, I had Yotam Heineberg prepared several hundred of these forms. I won't have time to go through all the details, but if you take it, it gives you the website information. And there's a trailer shown last night called The 10%, that the 10% of people in any situation we can count on to be heroes.
Well, that's extraordinary. And I think actually that comment with the others actually gives us some interesting insights into future directions and perhaps some aspects that we hadn't thought of. You know what I'd like to do now is to invite any member of the audience to come forward either with a comment in regard to future directions or a comment on how the conference itself may have or has had an impact either on your own scientific thinking and future directions or perhaps just for yourself. And as was whispered in my ear, can ask questions of the panelists. Thank you, Cliff. Oh, of course. I'm sorry. Before we start that, I'm sorry, Cliff. Please go ahead.
Phil, I wanted to ask you. There's always been a classical question whether or not social activism required a kind of righteous indignation or anger or a kind of railing against the machine, and whether or not in your training and in your research you actually have a kind of view that includes the establishment of equanimity and the perception of a very large view that motivates these actions. Because I think there's been a lot of work of burning out with respect to trying to change the system with a great deal of passion.
Yeah, essentially our work is really at the micro level. I mean, we go into high schools, middle schools, colleges, youth groups, and now we're doing some in corporations. And essentially it says, you know, what is the problem you see in your family, in your school, in your community that you think you could help change? Now, the first thing we do is we get away from the notion of the solitary hero. That's an old notion of the military warrior, the male military warrior. Heroes are most effective in networks. We know this from the Underground Railroad, from Jews who helped Christians, from Martin Luther King, the civil rights. And so essentially, the first thing you do is get allies. Okay, especially allies that are going to help you against bullies, against people who are discriminating against gays and lesbians and minorities. And then it's develop situational savvy. And so this is, you know, coming from the Bronx, the first thing you do is you have to know to size up every situation before you take any action. And most people don't. You just enter blindly. You know, and then you figure, next thing is, where is the power in the situation that you can essentially manipulate, but appeal to, attract, modify, and then the action is wise and effective. We don't want you to die. In many cases, the main thing is you call 911. In many cases, you get an authority. In many cases, you go around the teacher who's abusing students to the principal or to the parent-teachers group. So we try to teach them very reasonable, responsible, doable actions. And so we're trying to get away also from the reactive emergent hero. I mean, the person who jumps, Wesley Autry jumps on a railroad track to save a guy before the train runs over him. What we're trying to do is develop an orientation which is a training in everyday heroism. What is it you can do every day which is not heroic in itself, but is on the path to heroism? So for example, every day this week, your assignment is make somebody feel special. How do you do it? You give a compliment. Compliments are dead. You hear them here, maybe in Telluride. You don't hear them in San Francisco. You don't hear them in New York. Maybe you hear them in Rochester. I don't know. Anyway, so that's our approach.
So, I think what it is really here is that the reality is that everyone has the potential within themselves to every day be a hero.
Yeah.
And I think that is the message, and I think fundamentally that's a message of teaching compassion to all. If we can just go to our audience member.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Could you say who you are? Yeah.
Yeah. First of all, I want to thank you. I think the science for me as a psychotherapist and not as a researcher it gives me a sense of a hand at my back as I'm teaching about mindfulness. I call it neural incentives for practice. My heart's beating a little bit fast right now. There's so many things going through my mind, one of which is what recently happened in Aurora is something that I think could have been brought here to discuss the practical application of compassion. And I'm also curious because I've been hearing about sort of the blending of pro-sociality and compassion, and there's a distinction, as I think, and I forgot your name in the center there,
Cliff.
Daryl.
This young man, yes, that you were speaking to and other people are speaking to, that we may be having behaviors that seemingly are pro-social, but they're not necessarily compassionate, as we will see as this tragedy turns into entertainment and we all get on board because we seemingly care and we vilify the quote-unquote perpetrator, that's where the rich and deep compassionate practice comes in understanding the very acts that came from the suffering that creates the pain in our society, which is the excitement that I have about science, is now providing the possibility of creating secular mind training toward outcomes of behaviors that are more of benefit, that come from true compassion. And I'm sorry, I'm just kind of going all over, but I think I had about 5 hours of sleep because I made the mistake of turning on the television and watching what media does with these kinds of tragedies, and then feeling this confusion about being here, talking and studying about compassion, and then having that actuality happening that we might be working with directly.
No, I think everyone in this room, and I don't know if you were here when I made the comment, and actually we had a moment of silence for the victims, but there is this dissonance between on an intellectual level, having conversations about the potential of compassionate action, plus the reality of the engagement in relief of suffering. And it's a really challenge, and I think in the context of this conference, with that event that occurred, it's very difficult. I mean, I struggled myself.
No, this isn't an accusation.
No,
it's
no,
an
no, but
observation.
I did not feel that. I'm just giving you my own comment in response to what you said, though.
Yes.
But I think these are difficult questions sometimes, and I just appreciate you bringing that up.
Well, just one last piece there is a question I have for you to look at is when is compassion, and you were speaking to this, the defensiveness that comes up when compassion is perceived as dangerous, which has been seen, as in Thich Nhat Hanh being exiled, and any comments around 9/11 where we might perceive from the other perspective that we were not patriotic, and to have any kind of understanding of this particular perpetrator in this most recent act, it's a dangerous thing to have that level of compassion.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
So can I just answer that real quick?
Yes, please.
So just one brief thought. I mean, I think I agree that oftentimes compassion can, from our perspective, seem to be costly to embrace compassion, especially if it's towards perpetrators and situations like that. I mean, I recall when you gave a presentation recently, Cliff, you described your shamana findings, and you talked about how the Dalai Lama said that people should feel the most compassion for the soldiers that were committing abuses because their sensibilities have been so compromised. And I agree, it's really like difficult in thinking about how to build the efficacy for us to embrace our compassion. It's very, very difficult, and so it's admirable to see all the interventions that are trying to do that. But it's deciding when you want to actually experience something like real compassion as opposed to express some superficial prosociality that may or may not be motivated by compassion. I mean, there's a lot of work yet to do on that.
I have. When I was not graduating from Harvard as an undergraduate, because I had dropped out, I actually jumped the stage during graduation and gave a memorial speech for the 3 individuals in my freshman class who had committed suicide. And so we have a perpetrator here in Aurora who had just dropped out of neuroscience graduate school. And so I think, without knowing many particulars at all, there's a question of causes and conditions separate from individual psychopathology. And the culture of the academy and the degree of identification with success on terms that may be unachievable and thus result in a conclusion of utter and complete failure is an assumption and a mode that has to be deeply deconstructed and reconstructed. And so I think the move of compassion has to go, when I said deeper, I also mean into institutional frameworks.
Yeah. From my point of view, in these tragic situations, and this is just one of, there's been a dozen school shootings in the last decade. And we have the case in Norway, Anders Breivik, last year in Virginia, 2 years at Virginia Tech, the Korean young man who did abuses. Compassion for me means instead of giving in to the impulse to condemn, give in to the search for understanding. It doesn't forgive. I mean, I don't forgive automatically. Certainly not Anders Breivik. I mean, but the point is, let's understand why, and the reason to understand is to prevent. Okay, so that compassion alone is not going to prevent it, but the understanding that comes from compassion could lead to reducing the probability of another thing like that.
One additional thing in engendering compassion or promoting compassion is to look at history. If you look at colonial history in this country, where people were brought in as children, as slaves, as children, and sold to slavery, and they were encouraged to only look for themselves. And if you said one word, just cite an incident, there's 2 ladies working in a dress factory, and one of them put 1 extra inch of material into a dress. Her punishment was 100 lashes and double her quota of work. Her neighbor said, that's not fair. She was given the same punishment. So you don't stand up for the guy next to you. You mind your business. Fight that.
I think we have just enough time for a couple more questions, unfortunately. Josh, or comments?
Okay, so I did some graduate work, some of my doctoral research at Hebrew University under a man named Charlie Greenbaum, who right after the first Gulf War, he asked a bunch of kids, what things are you fearful of? And these were a situation where they had the safe rooms with the gas masks and everything, waiting for the bombs to land. And in all the things that they listed, the kids still listed the highest auto traffic accidents. And if you're from Israel, it makes more sense. But the point of this is, and it comes out a little bit more in my research with homeless youth that I did for a long time, that kids that were out on the streets with just tragic situations, experiencing some really gnarly things, would say, come up with the most recent event that might be traumatizing to you. And instead of all the truly traumatizing things that we would see in their life, they would say, well, I broke up with my boyfriend of 2 weeks just yesterday. And that was to them the perception of what was so worrisome. And I'm curious, particularly with what Phil's saying and everybody I think is saying in terms of context, how the individual perception of things then, of the suffering, comes into play there, how you would describe. I mean, I have ideas about, but I'd really love to hear what you think about that.
Is that Phil?
Well, Phil or anybody else. Phil was just kind of drawing towards these more contextualized factors within the individual.
I think that's a generic point, is that how do we understand how people perceive the world? And this is a problem every parent has, assuming we know how our children perceive the world. And the way you do it is you ask. You ask the question. So the researcher asks the question. But again, parents and teachers. In the world for young people, not only kids in disadvantaged neighborhoods, the world for young people is really a world filled with uncertainty now. I mean, kids graduating college and there's no job. The worst thing in the world to be is a PhD graduate this year. And you're lucky.
Shucks.
Well, you're lucky to get an adjunct job someplace. If you're in neuroscience, it's going to be a little easier. No, but again, it's really, part of being compassionate is really eliciting the other person's perception as part of understanding, in quote, where they're coming from before you can even give any advice.
Maybe we can go to the next line. Unfortunately, I think that's going to have to be the last. I'm sorry.
So I'm Judith Zimbardo from Naropa University, and I want to just say this has been an incredible feast. I've learned so much. What I've been waiting to hear through the whole conference is a question that came up when Paul Ekman spoke at the beginning. I see that and this is addressed to all of the presenters for the whole conference, it appears that the way that compassion training is being taught in many of these experiments is leaving off the most important part of the Buddhist tradition's reason for practicing compassion, and that is in particular compassion for the enemy. It seems that everybody's experiments drops off that part, and given the comments that have been made today and the questions ahead of me, it is also the most important part of the practice. And what I would like to request is that researchers in all of the projects begin to include practice. The whole reason we practice loving kindness is to develop muscles in our practice so that the hardest moment of compassion is actually something we get good at. And if we're going to solve the problems of the world, we have to practice compassion in a more unconditional sense by practicing on the people most difficult to love. So I implore all the experimenters to begin to really work with compassion for the enemy, the person hard to love, someone who's just irritating to begin with, going to more and more irritating, to more and more threatening, to the most difficult people in our life. Without that, this compassion training is really wimpy, and I think we could go much further.
Thank you very much, Judith, for that comment. I just want to point out in some of the work that Eric Rosenberg talked about yesterday in the Shamatha Project, we explicitly created stimuli that would evoke potentially contemptuous responses, not because we're actually showing soldiers who are they're talking about how pumped up they get in order to go out and kill. And they're happily showing the music they listen to in their helmets as they get ready to kill the enemy. And this is exactly what Daryl was speaking to when we showed this film to His Holiness. Everybody else was aghast in the room in response to these soldiers. And he was just, I can't say what he was. I don't have a theory of mind of the Dalai Lama.
I just want to remind you, please pick up these handouts that have all the websites and lots of the research that I didn't get to talk about. Thank you so much.
But we are looking at that. That's what I'm saying.